The terminal buzzed with that particular kind of chaos only a Friday evening could bring. Suitcases rolling, screens flickering, voices echoing. But at gate 36B, the noise faded beneath something colder. A tall, sharply dressed black man stood silently, his passport in hand, as the gate agent squinted at him like she was trying to see something he didn't have. "Sir," she said flatly, not even looking at his documents, "this line is for first-class boarding only." He didn't blink, just nodded once and gently repeated, "I believe I'm in the right line." The agent laughed under her breath, called over another staff member and waved her hand. "Security, please." A few passengers paused their conversations. A child holding her mother's hand stared wide-eyed. The man said nothing. He just pulled out his phone, dialed, waited, said one word in Arabic. 30 seconds later, a phone behind the desk rang, then another. Then the terminal's tone changed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just made a call. And within minutes, the entire airline would be scrambling to answer for what they'd done. Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from, and tap the bell for stories that turn silence into power. Hours earlier, that same man had walked through the sliding glass doors of JFK with the same quiet poise he'd carried his entire life. His name was Captain Idris Al-Rami, early 40s, posture straight as a rifle, footsteps measured but unhurried. He wore a charcoal gray suit that sat sharp on his frame, the subtle glint of a royal insignia pin resting above his chest pocket. Most didn't notice it. Most never do. He was no stranger to chaos. For over 2 decades, he had stood beside some of the most powerful figures in the world: royalty, diplomats, generals. As a decorated royal guard for the House of Al-Mazid, one of the most influential royal families in the Middle East, his silence was not weakness. It was protocol, precision, restraint taught in battle and reinforced in courtrooms. Now he was headed home, not by blood, but by duty. A first-class flight to Riyadh, not for comfort, but for a classified security summit, where Idris had been personally appointed to oversee protocols across 3 allied kingdoms. The ticket had been issued through diplomatic channels, non-refundable, non-transferable, undeniably official. Still, as he passed the food court and approached Gate 36B, he could already feel it coming, the subtle shift in the air, the cold glance, the tight smile that wasn't really a smile. He'd seen it before, not in war zones, in airports, and yet even then he paused to help. A young mother had dropped her bag trying to calm her crying toddler. Idris bent without hesitation, lifted the bag gently, handed over the pacifier from the floor, and offered a quiet nod. She whispered, "Thank you," and he smiled once before stepping forward. That same hand, just moments later, would dial the number that silenced the entire terminal. By the time Idris reached the boarding gate, the terminal buzz had softened into routine announcements and dragging footsteps. Gate 36B sat under a flickering overhead screen, its carpet worn from years of check-ins and corporate travelers pacing on conference calls. Idris waited patiently, his boarding pass and passport ready, tucked neatly into a black leather wallet. He stepped forward when the screen blinked. First class boarding now. Open. He approached the counter, extending his documents to the gate agent with quiet confidence. She didn't take them. Her eyes swept him once, then dropped to her tablet. "Sir, this line is for first class." "I'm aware," Idris replied gently, still offering his documents. Al-Rami, Idris. Royal Charter. There was no mistaking the clipped professionalism in his tone. He wasn't uncertain. He simply didn't believe in confrontation. But Melissa Hargrove had already made up her mind. Her lips curled slightly, the kind of smirk that hides behind policy. She didn't touch the documents. She just tilted her head. "I'm going to need you to step aside, sir. This line is for priority guests." There was no emphasis, but the word priority hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Idris didn't flinch. That's exactly what this boarding pass says. Behind him, a small group of passengers shifted, some averting their eyes, others watching with interest. Melissa sighed and finally reached for his boarding pass, but barely glanced at it before holding it between two fingers like it might disintegrate. "This doesn't look right," she muttered. "It says first class, but the system... Something's not adding up." Idris leaned forward just slightly, still calm. "It was booked by the embassy, directly through diplomatic clearance. You'll find the security tag embedded under the flight code." She didn't look. Instead, she nodded toward another staffer. "Can you get TSA? I think we've got someone trying to use a fake booking." That sentence, spoken loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, turned heads. A couple paused mid-step. One man even lowered his phone, watching with a flicker of suspicion. Idris said nothing. Melissa turned back to him, folding her arms. "Do you have any other ID, like a U.S. license?" "My passport is diplomatic," Idris said calmly. "It holds more authority than a state-issued license." "Right." She drew the word out, lips thin. "Well, we've had people try to fake those before, too." That was when he saw it. Not the comment itself, but the look in her eyes. She wasn't verifying. She was judging. There was no question in her mind, only confirmation bias. Idris's appearance didn't fit her image of royalty. He knew that look. He had seen it through bulletproof glass in foreign embassies. It didn't rattle him, but it meant something dangerous was unfolding. 2 TSA officers appeared within minutes. The taller one, Officer Drayton, walked with urgency and already had his hand near his belt. "What's the issue?" Melissa gestured without hesitation. "He's claiming first class with a suspicious booking. Says he's some kind of diplomat." "Says" was all it took. That one word dismissed decades of honor, training, and international clearance. "Sir, step over here, please," Drayton ordered. "Hands where I can see them." Idris looked at him, blinked once, then complied. He held his hands out slightly, palms empty. No resistance, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The passengers nearby stopped pretending not to look. A woman gathered her purse. A man whispered to his wife. To them, he was no longer a traveler. He was a problem. "Let's see your ID again," Drayton demanded. Idris handed the same documents without a word. Drayton stared at them, clearly unsure what to make of the embossed seal and Arabic lettering. "You got any English paperwork?" "I'm a royal guard assigned to diplomatic security," Idris said evenly. "If you'd like to call the embassy, they'll confirm it in less than a minute." "Right. Sure." Drayton wasn't listening. He held the passport up like it might be hiding something inside, squinting at every detail as if that might change the conclusion he'd already made. Melissa chimed in again, her tone sharper now that authority was backing her up. "You're really not helping yourself by being vague." "I haven't been vague," Idris said softly. "You simply haven't been listening." It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. A line drawn with no raised voice, no threat, just a refusal to be steamrolled. Drayton turned to Melissa. "Want me to pull him for further inspection?" Idris raised a hand, not high, not abrupt, just enough to pause the conversation. "There's another option," he said quietly. "You could simply scan the booking." Melissa didn't move. "Or," Idris continued, I can make a call. And within 5 minutes, the people you're trying to protect will be explaining this to their counterparts at the State Department. The words weren't boastful. They weren't even loud. But they were weighted, backed by a truth neither officer wanted to believe, but could feel settling between every second of silence. Melissa scoffed. You threatening me? No, Idris said finally, lowering his hand to retrieve his phone. I'm informing you. He turned slightly, walked 2 steps away from the counter and dialed. 1 ring. Then a voice answered in Arabic. Al-Mushkila Badat, Idris said. The problem has begun. He ended the call in under 10 seconds. Behind him, the mood shifted. Melissa's radio crackled. A red light began blinking on her tablet. The main phone at the desk began to ring. Then another. Then the terminal speaker overhead buzzed to life, paging someone none of them expected. But Idris didn't turn around. He simply stood there, his phone back in his pocket, watching the reflection of chaos ripple across the glass wall beside him. The ringing phone behind the counter went unanswered for 3 long seconds before Melissa reluctantly picked it up. Her voice, once sharp and dismissive, dropped to a confused murmur as she listened, her brows pulled together. The color in her face shifted. She glanced toward Idris, then away. Yes, he's here. But I wasn't aware. She stopped mid-sentence, lips pressing together as the voice on the other end continued. When she hung up, her posture was no longer confident. It was rigid. The other staff member leaned over. Everything okay? Melissa didn't answer him. She looked toward Idris, now silent and composed, hands folded neatly in front of him. Her earlier smugness had drained. She turned to Drayton and whispered something he couldn't quite hear, but the expression on the officer's face changed. He blinked twice, then stepped back from Idris as if he'd been standing too close to a flame he didn't see until now. Sir, Drayton said carefully, we may need just a minute to clarify some things. Idris gave a small nod, his gaze steady. Of course. That's when the second phone rang. This time, it was the airline supervisor on the line, calling not Melissa, but the airport terminal's main desk. Within seconds, 2 uniformed security officials appeared, followed by a tall man in a navy blue suit with an airport operations badge clipped to his belt. He didn't speak to Melissa. He walked straight to Idris. Mr. Al-Rami, he said, his voice lower, more careful. I apologize for the delay. We're sorting it now. Melissa watched, lips slightly parted. Wait, not now, the man snapped, not unkindly but with authority. Go handle gate 40. The dismissal was instant. Melissa froze in place, her feet rooted, her cheeks coloring, her voice caught somewhere between outrage and realization. But she said nothing. Not anymore. The man turned back to Idris. Sir, I've been asked to escort you to the private lounge while final arrangements are made. If that's all right with you. Idris nodded once. That's acceptable. He didn't glance at Melissa as he walked past her. He didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. As he stepped away, the crowd began to stir again, whispering questions they wouldn't dare ask out loud. The mother, from earlier, still waiting to board, locked eyes with him. He gave a slight nod of recognition. She smiled back, tentative, but understanding more than most. Inside the private lounge, Idris sat calmly while a staff member offered tea and apologized for the unfortunate confusion. He accepted the tea, but declined the excuses. Outside the glass wall, Melissa paced near the check-in station, her body stiff, her voice now hushed into a walkie-talkie. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled onto the tarmac outside Gate 36B. unusual, even alarming. Two suited men stepped out, one with a silver pin on his lapel that marked him as part of the Royal Security Liaison. The terminal shifted again. A few gate agents stopped what they were doing. Someone dropped a coffee cup. The airport manager himself arrived seconds later, sweating, slightly out of breath, trying to mask his urgency behind a smile. "Mr. Al-Rami, I understand you've been inconvenienced. We're working directly with your embassy now to ensure everything is resolved." Idris didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply set his teacup down and said, "I made one call. Not to punish, to remind." The manager blinked. "Remind, sir?" "That courtesy," Idris said, "should never depend on a uniform or a last name. It should begin the moment a person hands you their trust or their ticket." Outside, Melissa had been pulled aside by airport security. Her arms folded now, defensiveness replacing arrogance. She kept pointing toward the gate, toward Idris, but her voice no longer carried authority. It carried excuses. Idris stood adjusting the cuffs of his suit as one of the royal security men approached. "They're ready when you are, sir," he said quietly. "Let's not delay, then," Idris replied. As he walked back through the terminal, escorted this time by federal security, with his name now recognized by every screen, every voice behind every desk, he didn't so much as glance backward. But the message had been left behind in every breathless stare. Not all power shouts. Some of it just waits, quiet, composed, and absolutely undeniable. The moment Idris stepped onto the jet bridge, the energy shifted, not from sound but from posture. Flight attendants straightened, the purser adjusted her collar, and in the cockpit the captain stood just outside the door, nodding respectfully as Idris entered first class, not as a correction, but as recognition. They knew who he was now, and more importantly, they knew who had made the call. Melissa never reappeared at the gate. Seated in 1A, Idris didn't recline. He simply folded his hands and looked out the window as the tarmac crew bustled below. A quiet hum of logistics, unaware that just minutes ago, one call had frozen a department and rerouted a chain of command that stretched across embassies, airlines, and intelligence divisions. His phone buzzed once. A message. "Ambassador confirmed. Terminal cleared. You're green." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. A few rows behind him, two airline officials entered the cabin, whispering nervously to the head flight attendant. She nodded toward Idris. One of the men swallowed and stepped forward. "Mr. Al-Rami," he said carefully, hands clasped, "on behalf of the airline, I want to express our sincerest apologies for the incident at the gate. It shouldn't have happened." Idris turned slowly. "No, it shouldn't have. We're conducting an internal review," the man continued, "and we've escalated the report to both airport operations and federal liaison offices. I'm not interested in escalations," Idris replied calmly. "I'm interested in understanding how a person in uniform with the proper credentials can be dismissed so easily without anyone bothering to check a system that took millions of dollars to build." The official cleared his throat. "We agree, and measures are being taken immediately." Idris tilted his head slightly. "Good, because this wasn't about a seat. It was about dignity." The man nodded, clearly relieved there was no further confrontation, and excused himself. Idris didn't watch him leave. He returned to the window, where the airport moved like a controlled storm beyond the glass. Planes pulling in, bags loaded, workers guiding metal giants into alignment. Systems, when they work, are beautiful things. But when they're flawed, they don't crack, they quietly corrode. The pilot made an announcement shortly after, voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been cleared for departure. We want to thank you for your patience, especially to our diplomatic passengers joining us on today's flight." There was no name, no mention, but the nod was unmistakable. The engines roared to life. As the plane lifted into the sky, Idris closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but reflection. It wasn't the first time he'd been profiled. But this time, the story had changed. Not because of who he was, but because of what he chose to do with it. He could have let it slide, walked away, taken a later flight, and no one would have blamed him. But silence only works when it's chosen, not when it's forced. And what he made clear with a single call was that silence could speak volumes. By the time the flight touched down 12 hours later, the email had already circulated, not to Idris, but about him. A confidential notice marked "Urgent. Incident review, diplomatic mishandling at JFK" had reached the inboxes of 3 senior airline executives, 2 government liaisons, and 1 internal PR crisis team. Attached was a brief description of what had occurred at Gate 36B, along with a flagged transcript of the phone call that followed. But Idris wasn't concerned with the email. He was already back in Riyadh, stepping into the marble-lined hallways of the Royal Security Council building, where the air was cool, the floors silent, and decisions moved faster than apologies. He entered the debriefing chamber with quiet authority. The others stood when he walked in, not out of formality, but respect. These were the men and women who managed high-level state protocols. And Idris, though never one to speak unnecessarily, had called for this meeting personally. A projector flickered to life. A still image from the airport camera feed. Idris standing at the gate, arms out, surrounded by staff. Another slide. Melissa, mid-gesture, pointing away from the line. Another, the moment he made the call. "I want to make one thing clear," Idris began, his voice calm but unmistakable. This was not about ego. It wasn't even about race, though that part cannot be separated from the experience. It was about reflex. The reflex to deny, to assume, to humiliate, because something didn't match expectation. The room was silent. He clicked to the next slide. A policy document. "Our response must be greater than a press release. I propose immediate engagement with all partner airlines, cultural training, live scenario simulations, an accountability framework, built not on punishment but understanding." Someone spoke up. "We've had these conversations before, Captain. They come and go, and in 6 months, nothing changes." "Then this time," Idris replied, "we make it stick." A beat passed. Another voice, this time from the head of diplomatic logistics, leaned forward. "What about the airline? Have they responded directly?" Idris nodded. "They've requested a private conversation. They'll want to apologize, likely offer some hollow assurances." "And your response?" "I'll meet them," he said, "but not alone." The meeting ended with nods and silent agreement. It wasn't the kind of thunderous approval one might expect. But then again, Idris never needed thunder. He dealt in precision. 2 days later, inside a high-rise boardroom overlooking downtown Dubai, Idris sat across from 3 senior airline representatives, one from operations, one from legal, and one from international partnerships. They came armed with apologies, folders, and nervous smiles. Idris brought nothing but presents. "We'd like to extend a formal apology once again, on behalf of the airline," the lead executive began. "The gate agent in question has been suspended pending full review." "She wasn't the root," Idris said plainly. "She was the symptom." The man cleared his throat. "We understand that now, and we're prepared to work with your department to develop preventative training and oversight measures." "And the airport?" Idris asked. "Already in contact," the second executive chimed in. "They're open to revising their internal alert response system. Your feedback helped trigger a full evaluation." Idris nodded slowly. "Then let's start there. Quiet fixes don't last. Make it public. Make it real. Or this will happen again, and next time it won't end with a phone call." The executives scribbled notes, exchanged glances. None interrupted. Before he left, Idris paused at the door. "You have the resources, the systems. What you lacked was the mindset. Start there." Back at the embassy that evening, Idris received a call from the very mother he'd helped at the gate. Somehow, she'd found a way to reach out through diplomatic channels. Her voice cracked slightly through the line. "I just wanted to say thank you. I saw what happened. I wish I'd said something sooner." "You didn't need to," Idris replied. "You were watching. That's the first step." He ended the call with a rare smile. Because sometimes accountability doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with clarity. And for the first time in a long while, something had shifted. Not just because the system had been exposed, but because it had been seen. Fully, without excuse. Weeks later, Idris stood behind a modest podium in a sunlit conference hall in Riyadh. The event had been organized quietly but deliberately, a closed-door gathering of airport officials, embassy liaisons, airline executives, and a few members of the press. No fanfare, no dramatic music, no choreographed applause. Just people in suits, people in uniform, and people who had seen the cost of silence. He didn't speak with notes. He never did. His voice carried not because it was loud, but because it had something worth hearing. "I've served on security details for more leaders than I can count. I've walked ahead of kings, stood behind generals, and stood between diplomats and danger. But the most damaging threat I continue to face doesn't come from a weapon. It comes from a glance, a doubt, a hesitation born from bias." The room was still. "What happened at Gate 36B," he continued, "wasn't about a seat on a plane. It was about the instant someone saw me, not as a professional, not as a passenger, but as a problem to be removed. No questions, no verification, just dismissal." He paused, letting the words settle. "We've trained for emergencies. We've drilled for threats. But have we trained to recognize our own assumptions? Have we drilled for the moment when courtesy could prevent a crisis?" In the front row, a young flight attendant nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, but locked in. Idris looked across the room, his voice never rising, yet commanding complete attention. This isn't about calling out a single employee. It's not about revenge. It's about repair. Systems only work when the people inside them are taught to look again, to pause, to ask, and, most importantly, to listen. He shared how the airline had agreed to implement a new internal checkpoint procedure, not for security screening, but for bias reflection, where agents would be trained to pause before dismissing anyone based on instinct alone. He shared how the embassy would provide yearly support workshops, and how, for the first time, airport protocol handbooks would include a section titled, "Respect is not optional." But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Idris gestured to the side of the room. A familiar woman stood up, the young mother from the terminal. The same woman he'd helped pick up a pacifier, the one who had watched, silently, as he was humiliated. She'd been invited quietly, her travel covered by the royal office. She stepped onto the stage, unsure but determined. She didn't speak at the gate, Idris said, looking at her gently, but she didn't look away either. And in a world built on reflex, sometimes watching with clarity is where courage begins. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was respectful, steady, the kind that builds, not explodes. And that's exactly how change begins. As Idris stepped down from the podium, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt responsible. Because leadership, he knew, wasn't about position. It was about presence. And on that day, in that room, presence had finally spoken louder than the silence that tried to erase it. Later that evening, Idris walked alone through the royal compound's courtyard, where the marble reflected the deep amber of the setting sun. The same hands that had once held rifles, opened palace doors, and shielded dignitaries now slipped quietly into his pockets. There was no applause here, no audience, just stillness. And in that stillness, clarity. He thought of the gate agent, of the crowd that had watched, of the silence that so often protects the wrong people. And yet, he also thought of the woman who called days later, of the young staffer who nodded during his speech, of the systems that didn't collapse, but shifted, if only slightly, because power isn't always in the correction. Sometimes it's in the reminder. He didn't bring down an airline that day. He didn't issue threats or demand special treatment. He simply made one call and forced the world to look again, not at him, at itself. So now we ask you, have you ever seen someone turn a moment of humiliation into a movement for dignity? If that story moved you, share it with someone who needs to know that respect isn't granted by uniform or class. It's affirmed by how we choose to see each other. Let's keep that vision alive, one story at a time.